I don't want to go flat. We're going to get started. Let me welcome you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make my comments very brief. If any of you are not getting the morning brief, national security news roundup in the morning, or the cyber brief, the one on cyber on Mondays, let us know and we'll sign you up for it. You won't be sorry. Next Friday, we have an event with General Red Hernandez, who was the original head of Cyber Command, Army Cyber Command, when they set it up, and is going to talk to us about how the military thinks it's going to retool itself for the cyber challenges of the future. So maybe a little bit about whether or not we should actually have the same person as head of the NSA as we have as head of Cyber Command. So I invite you to that. If you want to know about it, ask us. For today, I think you probably know a lot about Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo, and I'll leave any of the details to either your reading or to Bob. I just want to thank Bob for doing this. He's become our go-to moderator par excellence. He's fantastic, but what he does when he's not moderating here is that he is one of the investigative reporters for NBC News. He has been there for decades. His specialty is intelligence, national security affairs, nuclear proliferation, etc. His book on Iran and nuclear arms is worth reading, which I mention every time, and it's in the bio if you want to go on Amazon and find it. I just want to say that it's so interesting that the entire country is consumed with the issues of surveillance. And today, in New York, we really need to bring a little bit of attention to what this all means for us, and I wonder what the conversation is between what's going on in Washington and what your book so graphically tells what's going on here. So,
we need to hold the microphones, or
yes?
Yes. Okay,
no.
Great. These are good ones. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you all for attending. I'm going to give a very quick intro to Adam and Matt. You have their bios. They're available outside. But the key thing is that these are two of the best reporters that we have now in any medium. They worked for AP. They won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for their work on the NYPD surveillance of Muslims, etc. They also won the Polk Award and a number of others. So what we have today is the product of that work. The book, Simon & Schuster, copies available in the back, which I will say multiple times. Having written one myself, I know how important that is. And I think the key thing here as we look at this book and we look at this issue, is the level of information that the American public and the New York public has on this topic, which, as we know, was very limited, and now there has been, over the last several years, both with their work locally and Edward Snowden's quote, work, unquote, recently, that this is now, as Karen noted, a full-fledged issue. And it could have ramifications politically. It certainly could have ramifications legally. And I wanted to make sure that when we talk about this today, we don't just limit ourselves to NYPD, because it is a larger work in progress. So let me start off by asking the two of you, and I'm going to be craning my neck throughout this, and I'll let either one of you decide who wants to talk. Ray Kelly and the NYPD have said that there have been 14 cases, close calls, that New York has had with planned terrorist attacks. How many of those were real?
Yeah, well, Matt and I looked at many of them, and many were not real. I'll give you an idea. So Abu Zubaydah, we all know who Abu Zubaydah is. Right? He was a terrorist. He helped Al-Qaeda with their logistics. He was in a black site and overseas, and he talked about how great it would be to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge. Right? That would be great if Al-Qaeda could blow up the Brooklyn Bridge. The problem with that plot is it wasn't a plot. It was Abu Zubaydah sitting in a black site controlled by the CIA. It was aspirational, okay? These guys dream up of doing a lot of things. It wasn't an actual plot. there were other instances of that too. But then there were obviously within those are more serious ones, like we talk about in the book with Najib al-Azazi, Fazl Shahzad, and a number of others. So there's some truth in that, and there's some exaggeration.
And on that, I think the NYPD's sort of talking points have changed for the better for as far as accuracy and informing the public goes. They used to say we've stopped 14 plots. With the NYPD, we've stopped 14 plots. That is just demonstrably false, and there was a really good story by Justin Elliott in ProPublica taking that down. It's now shifted to there were 14 plots against New York that did not succeed because of some combination of good work by the NYPD, good work by the federal government, or luck. And that's that's their line now, and that's probably as close to accurate. I think that's pretty accurate.
Now, the two that we've seen most recently were the Najib al-Azazi case and the Fazl Shahzad case, which was the New York Times, Times Square bomber. Now, in both of those cases, your research has shown that there was really no warning. That despite the surveillance that had been going on, despite the very, very invasive surveillance that was based often on religion, that these were not uncovered by the NYPD. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. These are the Najib al-Azazi case and the Fazl Shahzad case are important in this narrative because.
And if you could just describe the Najib al-Azazi case. The Times Square case, I think we're all familiar with, but the Zazi case is something that actually, in a lot of ways, went under the radar. Yeah, so Najib al-Azazi was a young man living from Queens. He was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan. He's of Afghan descent. His father immigrated here in 1990, and Zazi came along with his family in 1995, and they moved to Flushing, Queens, little Afghanistan, they call it. Along with Chinatown and the other names, and he got disenfranchised, and he started going down a wayward path. He dropped out of school. There wasn't much of a future. He was running a coffee cart, and basically became disillusioned with his time in America. Became disillusioned with what was going on in Afghanistan. Started seeing the number of civilians being killed there. By U.S. forces. The country wasn't getting better, it was in fact getting worse. And this is an individual who, by the way, supported the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11. And he shares his feelings with two of his buddies, a guy named Adis Madujanin, who also immigrated from Bosnia, and another young man named Zerain Ahmadzeh, who was also born as of Afghan descent, but born in a Pakistani refugee camp. And so these guys follow a common path. They get on the internet. They start listening to bad people like Anwar al-Awlaki, and they fall under their influences, and they decide they're going to go and wage violent jihad in Afghanistan. They're going to fight American forces. I mean, they have delusions of grandeur. Adis Madujanin thinks he's in fact going to be a Taliban general. This is a guy who doesn't speak any of the languages. He's never fired a gun, but he's going to go over there and be a Taliban general. So they go over, they fly to Peshawar, Pakistan, and they start making their way, but word gets out, and Al-Qaeda hears about these guys. And, links up with them and says, you should come and work for us, and they give them pseudonyms, and then they go up to northwest Pakistan, and they fall under the influence of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda says to them, look, we don't need you guys to go to Afghanistan. We don't need you to be fodder for American howitzers. We have something better for you to do, something more important. You've got passports. You can get back into the States. And initially they declined. They're like, well, we don't want to kill ourselves. Right? We don't want to do that. I mean, that's not what we came over here before. We want to be soldiers. There's glory in that, right? We want to fight. And they all have these romantic ideals of this. And it was interesting because while they were over there in 2008 is when we were ramping up the drone program. When General Hayden was running the CIA, they started increasing the number of drone
drone attacks. And Al-Qaeda used that to their advantage and said, look, see what's going on in the sky. You know, there were reports in newspapers that, you know, civilians were being killed, and they used that to turn these guys. And so they come back, and they get their training, and they come back, and on September 6th, 2009, Zazi has built part of this bomb, and
To be used in the subway.
to be used, they're going to blow up 3 subway lines. I think it was the, if I remember correctly, I think it was the 3, 5, and 6. They're going to do it during rush hour time to 9/11, and it would have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And you can imagine what would have happened deep in these tunnels with these subways that had blown up. I mean, maybe everybody in them would have died from asphyxiation. It would have been horrible. The end result was Zazi sent an email to his Al-Qaeda handler in Pakistan, and the NSA intercepted that email. And what we know today through PRISM, and we can talk a little bit about that later about whether PRISM really stopped this. But anyway, the FBI working, the JTTF in New York, JTTF in Denver, working with local police, CIA, NSA, they managed to support this thing and prevent this terrorist attack. But as Matt and I learned, we had all these NYPD documents, and we learned that the NYPD was in their mosque. They had an undercover officer in their mosque. They had informants in their mosque. The imam was what the NYPD would call a cooperative. He's not a paid informant, just somebody who cooperates out of his own free will. And they'd infiltrated Adis's Muslim Student Association. They had an undercover in his MSA. They missed him. They had even infiltrated the travel agency where they bought their tickets to Peshawar. They had been in their restaurants. They had been in even the YMCA down the street. So at every single point, they missed them. I'll make another point about Faisal Shahzad. Faisal Shahzad was communicating with his handlers using PGP, using encrypted software when he was sending his emails. The federal government didn't know that. It got through. But when that Nissan Pathfinder almost went off, it wasn't because of the thousands of cameras that the NYPD ballyhoos in Times Square. If we remember, it was a Muslim vendor. A Muslim vendor saw a smoking truck and said something. But the last point I'll make about these two terrorist attacks is nobody in New York afterwards, and I was here, I was a reporter in New York City, and I covered that. Nobody stopped to say, hey, wait a minute, what are we paying for? And did it work in our most important time of need after both of those?
Covered it.
Now, the other thing, I mean, without getting in too far afield early, is the same can be true, said, of the Boston Marathon bombers.
Yeah, I mean, the Boston Marathon bombers are different in that, certainly different from Zazi.
Well, they succeeded also.
Well, they succeeded, right. But they're certainly different from Zazi because, I mean, Zazi is actually, Zazi and his guys are actually Al-Qaeda trained. These guys were trained by one of bin Laden's top deputies, and they got the full Al-Qaeda indoctrination. The Boston Marathon bombers, in many ways, a more terrifying, cadre because they're, we've seen no sort of foreign training. We've seen sort of no ties to a, this was directed by a foreign group.
Although we don't know specifics about Dagestan, the older brother.
Sure, but I mean, they haven't found any evidence. I mean, our best information is now a couple weeks old, but we've talked to a couple, very senior people on this who said, we don't see a link yet. We're still looking, but we don't have a link. We don't have direction. We don't have training. We don't have, anybody saying, go carry this out. In self-directed, self-radicalized, angry people in this country, whether we're talking about a Lanza or or a Boston Marathon case, that's its own unique thing. And I don't know that we have an answer for that.
One of the things that essentially we're getting down to here is there have been 3 attempted terrorist attacks, serious attempted terrorist attacks in the Northeast Corridor in the last 3 years. Well, I guess 4 years now. One of them succeeded in Boston. One of them in Times Square, actually was carried out that failed, and the third was in the final planning stages, correct, to describe it that way? And yet, despite the NYPD, despite the NSA, although to a certain extent, as you pointed out, in one of them there was an NSA, role in this, that none of that seemed to have worked in terms of of thwarting this. I mean, is that a fair assumption?
Well, let me address Zazi, you can address the other ones. Zazi did work. I mean, the system, Zazi made a mistake. That's what happened. Zazi sent the email days before they were going to carry out the attack. And he stuck his head up out of the sand. And U.S. intelligence was ready to cut it off, effectively. And he made one mistake, but that's what U.S. intelligence community counts on. They count on these guys making mistakes, and Zazi made that mistake, and they were able to thwart it because of it.
Yeah, that's the point I was thinking about.
But the NYPD did not initially pick up.
Right. I mean, as Adam said, I mean, they had every opportunity. If these programs were built to catch Najibullah Zazi. I mean, after 9/11, when David Cohen, the former top clandestine officer of the CIA, was tapped to run the intelligence division at the NYPD, and he brought in an active duty CIA officer named Larry Sanchez. They built these programs to catch a Najibullah Zazi. They looked at the dossiers on all the 9/11 hijackers, and they saw, wow, there were opportunities along the way where people saw signs that we now look back and say, oh, geez, they began to talk tough. They began to sort of distance themselves. They grew beards. Then they shaved beards. So there were access points, and they built programs that said, and you can see the logic here, right? I mean, if the NYPD could just act as the surrogates for all these people who saw warning signs and didn't realize what they were seeing, then maybe we could catch the next guy. So they'd send, plainclothes detectives of Arab and South Asian descent. They'd start their morning at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and they'd go for a cup of coffee at an Egyptian coffee shop, and they'd put in a file. This is an Egyptian coffee shop. It seats 9 people. The guy behind the counter, his name is Ahmed. He speaks decent English. He says he prays at this mosque. He doesn't appear to be dressed in devout Muslim attire. The clientele, however, is dressed in devout Muslim attire. I observed two Pakistani men discussing the State of the Union address in Urdu, and they said they didn't like American foreign policy, or they did like American foreign policy, or somebody said they didn't think drones were effective, and this all goes in files. Now, if me and Adam discuss, if Adam and I discuss the State of the Union address, that is sort of First Amendment speech that the NYPD is not supposed to put in police files. But the NYPD argues, well, if they're talking about it in Urdu, that in and of itself makes it terrorism related. That's not a joke. That is for real. That is if they're talking about it in Urdu, that is terrorism related and justifies putting in a police file. So if they're talking about what the State of the Union, what American politics or drones or foreign policy in Urdu, or in a place where people of Arab or South Asian descent might gather, that makes it terrorism related.
Now, one of the things that you write about is raking. Describe raking to the audience.
That was just raking. What I just described to you, that's raking. Those are 2 plainclothes officers. They're known colloquially as rakers, and the idea being is, look, most of these coffee shops and halal delis and travel agencies and internet cafes, innocent people who have nothing to do with terrorism. But if we, like a fire pit, if you were to rake the coals correctly, you might find a smoldering ember. So that's what these guys were looking for, hotspots. And you can understand the rationale for that. I mean, you have to put yourself in the sort of immediate after 9/11. What are we going to do? We're going to be hit again. We don't understand this huge population that exists particularly in the outer boroughs, and we need to understand it. So you can see the logic of why they did it.
Now, but describe the process. How is that Egyptian coffee shop selected? How are these people, how are the NYPD, how does an NYPD, for example, develop an informant? You talked about informants. I mean,
well, these are
the ranking process is somewhat involved in this.
Well, there are two separate. There are two separate processes. Okay, they use nationality to drive the ranking. So they're literally mapping the human terrain of New York City. So they would do for the Egyptians, Moroccans, Syrians, Palestinians, Pakistanis. They did it for Albanians, and so on. They actually had
28 ancestries of interest,
yeah, including Black American Muslim, which we know is not an ancestry of interest. So what they did, how did they make their informants? Well, if you were of one of these ancestries of interest and you get arrested in New York City, you will get a visit by what's called the debriefing unit of the NYPD. They will send detectives to lockup or to the precinct, and they will come and they'll talk to you. They'll ask you questions. Are you Shia? Are you Sunni? What mosque do you pray at? And so on. And eventually they'll say to you, would you be willing to work for the NYPD? And you can imagine these people, some of them are in very vulnerable spots, right? You've just been arrested. I know there was one example of an Afghan cab driver who got arrested for prostitution. It's really a crime of shame, right? He doesn't want to go home and doesn't want to fess up to his wife. He got dinged for being with a prostitute. So they would agree to work with the NYPD, and they churned out informants that way. And we never learned how many they made, but they made a lot. And on some of the documents, they simply were looking for anybody. One document showed how they debriefed the guy, and he didn't know anything. He was just some schmo. And some, an historian. And they were like, well, he could be good for sitting around in cafes, right? Was that the expectation? We're going to go into a cafe and we're going to be eavesdropped on? So
now, in some of the discussions that I've had on this subject, one of the things that was pointed out to me was that if they had somebody of interest, real interest, rather than a schmo, they would track them and then they would arrest them for the first available misdemeanor they could find. I was told, in fact, that in one case, there was a person who they were really interested in turning into an informant, who they gave a ticket to for taking up 2 seats on the subway. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, it's consistent with what they would do. There was a team at the NYPD called the X Team, and they were primarily, their job was, if they didn't know who the guy was that they were interested in, they'd just follow him around until they, ran a red light or didn't come to a complete stop when making a right-hand turn, and they pull them over, and then at least you get their ID, you get them for identification purposes. And again, if you needed to get them, some leverage on them, and you can find a crime to bring him in on, that's certainly consistent.
they're doing the same with the Pakistani taxi drivers, with the cart vendors. If your paperwork is in order, they'd squeeze you, and they could turn you into an informant.
One of the things that getting to where a lot of this intelligence came from to help target, because there was some targeting of particular individuals, there was some targeting of particular areas, neighborhoods, etc., was that the process would start with the intelligence being sent and basically unexpunged from the CIA through Larry Sanchez to the NYPD, in some cases specifically, but in some cases it was more general. Like, we're seeing a lot of activity among Moroccans.
Yeah, so this would come in and they'd say, we're seeing more chatter about Moroccans. And so this was a theme we heard a lot about. A lot of these detectives, they're really, really good people. and they want to keep the city safe, and they don't have a background in intelligence. These guys had gotten to the top of their game doing drug cases and gang cases and homicides, and so Larry Sanchez and Dave Cohen. I mean, Larry's active duty CIA and is directing domestic intelligence gathering. This is an unprecedented moment in American policing. And, so the intelligence comes in to the NYPD, and it's like these guys describe it as like the soup du jour. Today it's Moroccans. What do you got on Moroccans? I need Moroccans. Tomorrow it's Egyptians. What do you got on Egyptians? And these guys, they go to their morning meeting, and they're told, if you're the last guy to visit a place and a terrorist comes out of that place and you miss the thing, it's on you, And so there was this idea of like, well, geez, I don't want this on me. And I don't know. A lot of these guys were like, look, I don't know what's significant. Like, I don't know what...
I have no cultural training.
Right, well, not even just cultural training. Like, I don't know what's significant. So you get notes that say, like, I observed this guy's apartment. I observed 2 Qurans. Okay, I mean, is that, what's the number of Qurans that makes you suspicious? Is it 3 Qurans or is it 2 Qurans? Is it, I mean, how many Bibles makes you like, I don't know, crazy? Like, so how many Qurans makes a terrorist? It's just report them, right? Just report it. And so you end up with just a lot of reporting that, that's well-intentioned, that even the analysts we talked to were just like, these guys don't know. I mean, then they hired some smart analysts, and they say, the reports we see, oh, geez, how do 2 Qurans? What am I going to do with 2 Qurans? But that's where this comes from. That that's the pressure. And again, it comes back to this idea of, it starts well-intentioned, and it sort of snowballs to something that's not recognizable.
And it's somewhat pervasive. I think we spoke earlier, and I said that one of the things that I had been told when I was looking into this, and obviously I didn't publish anything, which you of course did, was that it was pervasive, and it involved not just the NYPD, that it involved other agencies of the city. I was told, for example, that the city planning department and the city board of education were involved.
Yeah.
That the Board of Education, Moroccans, where do we have Moroccans in the city? And the easiest way to determine that was Board of Education. And also you were talking about the city planning department as well.
Can I just talk about a name change for a second? So there were 2 cases. One was in Arkansas, a guy shot at a recruiting station. And then one was in a military recruiting station. One was in Illinois, where a guy had been involved in helping plan the terrorist attacks in Mumbai. And in both cases, it involved somebody who had changed their name. And in Little Rock, the guy had changed his car. It was born Carlos Bledsoe, and he changed his name as he converted to Islam and radicalized. And then in Illinois, we had a guy who was born with an Arab name, changed his name to David Headley so that he could travel unnoticed. And these 2 cases got a lot of attention inside the NYPD. And so what they did is they built a program that said they went to the state court, and everybody in the city of New York who changes their name legally now goes into an NYPD file. This stopped, I guess, after we reported on it, and then they would say, okay, look, what looks like Muslim names? People going from American names to a Muslim name, or a Muslim name to an American name. If you're going to an American name, maybe you're doing it because you're like a David Headley and you want to lay under the radar screen. If you're taking, if Joe Smith becomes, Amir Ahmed, maybe he's a terrorist. So they would put these guys into files and they would background everybody, and then they'd send police out to go and interview people. Of course, you can't make these guys talk because they hadn't done anything wrong. And the guys who had to go out and do the interviews told us, you'd go and meet these guys, Amir Ahmed, who became John Smith, and without fail, they'd come back and be like, yeah, he's tired of being harassed because people think Amir Ahmed is a terrorist, right? And so put it in the file that and so it's this, they realized, the guys doing the interviews realized, we're not catching anybody, this is a waste of time, but it's a good example of how other data points in the government get sort of drawn into this.
And
Yeah.
the specifics, if we can.
Yeah, even today, they're still, with what's going on in Syria, I saw documents recently where they're asking for the names of Syrian cab drivers from the taxi, I guess the TLC, right, Taxi License Commission, and they're still getting that information. I don't know if they can do this now, but they were getting the I-94s that, people.
I-94 is a...
It's what you fill out when you come into the country.
As a visitor.
As a visitor. And they were getting that, and the DHS was giving them, or no, Custom Border Patrol was giving them the I-94s, and they're going out, and they're going and talking to these people. I don't think they get the I-94s anymore. But, basically, I mean, you can imagine, right? Dave Cohen came from the CIA, right? He ran the clandestine service there. There is an insatiable appetite for information, right? I mean, we're seeing it with the NSA on an extraordinary scale. And the CIA is no different. They're collectors, right? We just need to collect as much information as possible. So any entry point to a city agency, or DHS, they were trying to use to get information.
One of the other things that I have been told, and I think that this is reflected in the book, is that the NYPD would brag that it had 2 informants in every mosque, no matter how large of a mosque or not. And that was not serendipitous. That was a goal, right? That to have informants.
Why'd you run that story, man? You know a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
It seems like everybody in New York Story knew this story and nobody ran it.
I'll tell you an interesting story about some of the reporting and what Matt and I are going back, and we were looking at some of the things that had been reported before we started writing the series, right? We needed to know what had been reported, so we knew what was new. So one of the things we found was when the Herald Square case, right? There were these 2 guys. They were going to blow up the Herald Square subway stop in Manhattan. They never got that far, but they did do surveillance and did some sketches, and they were convicted, and they went to prison.
And there was an informant who drove it.
Right, it was an informant who drove it. He got paid $100,000. But when we were going back and looking at the trial coverage, sort of broad outlines of things had come out. And Matt and I were looking at it like that was a real moment. It was a real moment for the media in New York to sort of start peeling back the onion. Because the broad outlines of that program was there. And so one of the things we noticed in the coverage and came out in trial is that the NYPD admitted that they were putting listening posts, right? Human listening posts into these communities. And I'll give Matt a lot of credit, and it's in the book. Matt went back and found the origins of listening posts. Matt?
Came out of the church committee. Listening posts were used by the FBI in what was known as the Ghetto Informant Program. And they said, well, if we put informants in the ghetto as listening posts, then maybe we can be sort of the first people we can get early word of.
And this is 60s and 70s.
1960s and 70s, the Ghetto Informant Program. So that's the origin of listening posts.
Now, but there was a program to make sure that they had as many informants as possible, and it was targeted on mosques.
Oh yeah, I mean, at one point, Cohen said he wanted to have an informant in every mosque within, what, a 50-mile radius, I don't remember what it was in the book, about New York City.
Yeah, I think that they had raped every mosque. So they went into a mosque, and the NYPD was determining whether this was a mosque of concern. And I think by 2006...
That's a real phrase.
Yeah. Right. So by 2006, I think they had, 43, like close to 50 mosques of concerns. And they had informants in the mosque, they had undercovers in the mosque. We have their files so we can see which mosque they had penetrated and the number of informants and undercovers in there.
And how did you get those documents?
Can I just want to say one other thing on the mosque? So, under the law, under the consent decree that the NYPD operates under, you're not allowed to collect information on purely First Amendment activities unless it sort of relates to terrorism, and you can't. You're not supposed to use undercovers and recording devices and whatnot unless it's part of these sort of legitimate investigations. What the NYPD did, which we didn't realize when we were writing the stories, but we did in our reporting for the book, is that they labeled mosques as terrorism enterprises, and that way, look, the NYPD, if they're investigating me, they can follow me into a mosque and listen to what I say. If I'm a legitimate target of an investigation, they can do that. But if I'm the only legitimate target, they're not supposed to like listen to everybody else and put them in files. But if the whole mosque is the enterprise, then everybody who visits can be recorded, can be put in files. They can put license plate readers in the parking lot and collect license plates on every single worshiper who shows up. They can set up a video camera and set up people coming and going. They can use hidden microphones on key fobs or or whatever, in watches and record sermons. Because if the mosque is the target, then everybody is a subject to the investigation and subject to surveillance. And these investigations would go on for years and years and years and just get re-upped. And they've never made a case off any of this, but it's the legal justification for the surveillance.
And you said they can do this, and they did it.
Oh, yeah, and they did do it. Yeah, and I mean,
how widespread was that?
We were able to identify at least a dozen mosques that were targeted as labeled terrorism enterprises in investigations that just went on for years and years and years.
What was interesting is we have some of the predicate. We have their investigative statements, and we've actually made this one public on enemieswithinbook.com. By the way, we make every NYPD secret document we use to write this book, we have posted online. So you can read the chapter, you can go to the endnote, you can go to Enemies Within Book, and you can look at the document yourself. So one of them is for a peaceful group called Tablighi Jamaat. And so Tablighi...
That's right. What?
They're mostly in Queens. Their North American headquarters is in Queens. They have a mosque in Queens. But they're basically evangelicals of Islam, right? But they're peaceful people. But people like John Walker Lynn, Richard Reed, they've passed through and been converted by this group. The group itself is not a terrorism organization, but yes, bad people have passed through, just like you might find bad people passing through the Lubavitch community, the Satmar community, the Italian, name your community, and there are millions and millions of these people. So the NYPD, their predicate to open up this TEI on the mosque and on the headquarters and surveil the imam was because a couple of bad people had floated through the organization. Thus there was a possibility, basically, that this was a front for Al Qaeda, and this went on for years, and they did it in '03, in April of '03. Our last readout on it was close to 2010, but they never made a terrorism enterprise investigation, and nobody. Tablighi Jamaat is not on terrorism. It's not on the State Department's terrorism list.
Let me make somewhat of a switch here to law enforcement, and that is that Larry Sanchez no longer is in the NYPD. There's no longer any representation. How did it happen that Sanchez and the CIA representation was removed?
Well, after Larry Sanchez was there for 2 years, active duty CIA, paid by CIA. He was sent there, he was directing collection for the NYPD. And then went 2 more years as took a leave of absence from the CIA to go on the books for NYPD. And then it was there for another 2 years. Finally the CIA was like, you gotta choose, man, you can't wear both these hats here. So he ended up leaving the CIA and going to the NYPD to finish up as assistant commissioner. After he left, one of sort of people bounced through, but there was a guy named Lance Hamilton who showed up and was detailed to the NYPD Intelligence Division. And Lance is one of the most senior CIA officers in the agency. He had run stations in Pakistan. He had run the station in Jordan. Extremely senior guy. And when we found out he was there, we said, okay, what's he doing there? And Kelly and those guys were like, he's there for information sharing. He helps us get federal, he gives us federal information. And the federal government was like, no, he doesn't. Absolutely not. That's not what he does. He's there on a management sabbatical to learn management training from the NYPD. And then when we went back to the NYPD, they're like, right, yeah, he does analysis for us. And the CIA was like, absolutely not, that's not what he does, he's not there to do analysis. So nobody, the DNI says, he does analysis. And we're like, well, he's not an analyst, he's an operative, he's a career operative, he's not an analyst. They're like, oh yeah, he misspoke, he's not there to do analysis. Okay, well, what's he there for? He's coming home. And then he just sort of came home, and that was the end of it. So the CIA says they're not going to do that anymore, and it doesn't look good. There was an Inspector General report after our story that said, we didn't break the law, but we realized that in our haste to protect the country after 9/11, we didn't put good guidelines in place, and we sent him up there with no rules, and we didn't oversee him, and he stayed there too long, and it wasn't a good idea, but we didn't break any laws.
Right. One quick question. I've been told, somebody in the NYPD told me that one of the reasons why they were pulled was because the FBI basically told them, and that the FBI pressed to have them removed.
No, I mean, the FBI had concerns about what he was doing there, given his role in, being at the forefront of the CIA's cutting edge.
It was actually CIA station that had a bigger issue.
Yeah, it was CIA station.
CIA station in New York. The senior guys at the station were like, well, what the hell is this guy? He's, senior intelligence service, SIS-4 is working out of the NYPD. I'm the guy who's the boss of, the station.
Yeah, I think the Bureau, as we reported this, and it's in our book, and it was in the series that we wrote together, the FBI became they had a lot of concerns about a lot of things, but one of the things they really became concerned about is when the NYPD took a guy by the name of Steve Pinkel, and while Hayden was DCIA, and they put him through the farm.
Which is, the farm is the CIA training center in Camp Peary, Virginia.
Right, so, they didn't understand why you were taking a police detective. Let's remember, this is a municipal police department. This is not the CIA, it's not the FBI. And they were putting him through an espionage program, right? It's the
operations program.
Yeah, the operations program to teach him to break the laws of other countries. And to do, they didn't understand why they needed, an NYPD detective needed to be trained by the CIA to work back in Queens. And they felt like that was blurring the line.
Right.
So it's time for questions, but I'm going to ask the first question while everybody
You
else.
have that prerogative.
Thank you. While you're thinking about your questions. And my question is, can you speak to what your point is? And I mean this way, is your point that the NYPD has been violating the Constitution? Is your point that it's making us less safe? Would you go so far as to say that? Is your point that this has been a distraction from other things they should be focusing on? Sort of what's the general or set of what's wrong in your minds with what you told?
Here's what's wrong. Government is a social contract that we make amongst ourselves. We give the government the authority to do things to us. We say, you can tax us, you can get search warrants and search our homes, you can arrest us if we do these bad things, you can put us under surveillance, you can charge postage, whatever this is, that's government. Government is a social contract. We give up some stuff in exchange for a functioning society. What we have here, and why you're seeing an issue with, why you're seeing the Snowden stuff resonate, is a social contract doesn't work if you have no idea what you're giving up. No idea. And you have no idea what you're getting in return.
And by we, you mean U.S.
People.
Whether they are Muslim,
right.
green
People
card
have
holders,
no
whatever.
idea what they're giving up and have no idea what they're getting in return. So the government says, we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. Trust us, it's working. Okay? And then every day that you're not blown up, thus proves that what they're doing works. But that doesn't work. That's, post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Every night before I go to bed, I have a bowl of vanilla ice cream, and I haven't been trampled by elephants yet. So thus, eating ice cream keeps elephants away. It just doesn't make sense. Like, you have to know. And we're dealing with a police department that has taken on an unprecedented level of surveillance authority with zero oversight from city council, zero oversight from Congress, zero oversight from the White House, Zero oversight from anybody. Zero oversight from people who were hearing this stuff for a long time and never wrote anything about it. That's what's wrong. The social contract doesn't work if we don't know what we're giving up and we don't know what we're getting in return.
Let's start. Right in front here.
Hold on.
Wait for the microphone.
Many thanks for all of your incredible work. This has been a marvelous presentation. Just one comment. The Russians warned both the CIA and the FBI about the elder Tarsanev brother, and even that was not enough with the NSA's data collection to...
let me address that. You know, the Russians weren't specific, and the FBI went back 3 times to them and asked for more information. The FBI, you know, there are levels. There's something called the DIAG, right? The Domestic Investigations Operations Guide. It's 308 pages. It lays out how the FBI can do these investigations, you know, what steps they can take. The first one is an assessment. They open an assessment on the older brother, okay? There was no criminal information, right? You can love Osama bin Laden. It's not against the law. I mean, you can hate America. It's not against the law, right? So they did an assessment. They didn't find anything. They extended it, actually, I think it went up to 30-day assessment. They extended it 3 times. They did 90 days. There was nothing. They closed the case. There wasn't anything to move on. And you can ask yourself, you know, we can sit here and we can say, well, they shouldn't have closed the case. They should have kept investigating. But is that the action of a police state? Because, you know, it's funny, I was talking to somebody from the FBI, and he said, yeah, take away the dialogue. He's like, just let us investigate Americans. We did that before. We go, you know, remember that church committee? We went down that path before. So,
investigate somebody for 90, or investigate an American for 90 days, find no evidence, and then we just keep all the files open because we never want to close the file.
Or, well, you know, devil's advocate here. I mean, maybe they didn't do a good job.
Nobody has presented that we've seen, and I'm very interested in this from an accountability standpoint. I haven't seen the domestic intelligence information that was sort of criminal predicate to stop him beforehand yet, and nobody's.
But it is feasible.
It's possible that it was there.
They do a very good job.
It's definitely possible.
Let me go to the back here. Josh.
I was struck by something that you said, oh, sorry. You said that well-intentioned, and I'm curious how it could be well-intentioned when it's so transparently racist, so transparently religiously discriminatory. It is Korematsu technologically advanced on a soft level, and it goes hand in hand with a department that operates a stop and frisk program that's been racist since I was a kid and continues to be. So I don't know how. I mean, I understand individuals well-intentioned. I understand career issues, but I don't understand how people could be blind to the implications of what they're doing. I just want to point out that Judge Kevin Duffy, who tried the Ramzi Youssef cases, who tried the first World Trade Center bombing, has 4 Korans and is proud of it. So I don't know where that puts him on the matrix, on the metric.
Pretty high up, man.
Exactly. So, but he wouldn't show up in a NYPD report, I'm sure, and his Koran ownership.
Josh, I think we didn't meet anybody. I don't think we met anybody who spent a lot of time with these guys, who honestly wasn't trying to do the right thing, and I think that's important. I don't think these guys. Look.
Oh, what's the right thing here? I don't understand. How do they define right thing?
I think that's a big part of it. Look, the whole war on terrorism, we still don't know what the hell we're doing, right? We're at war with a tactic. It's like being at war with fist fighting, right? It's like you will never win a war against fist fighting. As long as that's your goal, you are guaranteed to lose. The whole thing is weird. And these guys, again, career guys who've had long histories, and there's a chapter in the book where we spend a long time with the guy who ran the demographics unit, and he came back from Iraq, and he's a decorated, legit war hero, and came back, and they put him in charge of this unit, and he thought this was the best thing. He was finally, he was doing his part to keep the city safe, and ultimately he realized all these guys we're just paying them to sit at coffee shops, and they're buying pastries before they go home, and they keep going back to the same kebab places because they serve good food. So if you serve good food, you're more likely to end up in a police file.
I just want to make a point too, and Ray Kelly has said this. Well, we even write in our epilogue, maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. Matt, our position, we're journalists, we're not prosecutors, we're not lawyers, and we didn't set out to say whether this was illegal or not. I think the Hanshu judge is going to weigh in a big way. He didn't have all the information what they were doing. We're going to see the result of that. But I think the primary point of the book and the reporting was to raise good questions, to let New Yorkers know what was going on. And you know what? Ray Kelly has said after our reporting, nothing has changed. I have not changed one single thing. That is not our responsibility as reporters. We're not here as change agents. That's a responsibility of people who live in New York City. If you want change, then find the guy who's going to do it. But that's not our responsibility.
We're going to go to this side of the room first. This gentleman's right by the microphone.
Yeah, how many people are tasked from NYPD in counterterrorism, and are the informants that they use, are any of them paid?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of paid informants. We weren't able to get, I mean, thousands, but we weren't able to get a firm number on it. I mean, there's all the files on that are kept in this sort of little room in Chelsea. But, you know, there's like 300 guys in the intelligence division, you know, guys, men and women, you know, analysts, detectives, and senior folks working both at the, you know, the office in Chelsea and out at the Brooklyn Army Terminal.
What's the budget, and what is the range of money that informants have received?
Well, I interviewed an informant. He outed himself on Facebook, and I was able to get to him before he took that post down, and got him to talk on the record. His name's Shamir Rahman, and now he's caught up in this litigation in the Hanshu and in the ACLU's lawsuit. And he was making, you know, a few $100s a month, sometimes as much as $1,000 a month. I mean, it allowed him. He didn't have to work. You know, he had money to buy pot, and so, you know, I think the estimates range. There was one guy we wrote about. His name is Ali Aziz. He was the NYPD's #1 informant. Spent years infiltrating the Muslims of America. You might know them. They're a ragtag bunch of converts living in trailer homes. They are not a terrorism threat, but they paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars. He ended up failing an FBI polygraph, which we posted up on enemieswithinbook.com. This was their #1 informant, and he failed an FBI polygraph. It looked like he had told the Egyptians what he was doing, and now the federal government's trying to deport him.
This lady right here has had her hands up.
Hello, Janine Harper, Fuji Television. I just wanted to say thanks for putting the documents that you uncovered up on the internet where people can locate them. And I wanted to ask you what advice you have for getting around NYPD stonewalling or getting documents or other information that you're trying to.
Well, we treat the NYPD just like any other secretive investigation. Organization, we never go through the front door. So we find you on the internet, and then we call you, we go to your house, we knock on your door.
Sort of like the NYPD.
Yeah, sort of like the NYPD, though we actually say who we are, we're reporters, and we don't twist your arm. But I mean, that's the way you have to do it. If you're going to go through the front door, if you're going to live, then you're going to get what they want you to know, right?
Did you use any Freedom of Information laws to get any of the documents?
We only one time, the NYPD was running a safe house in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and they broke the first rule of running a safe house. They left it unmanned. And the building superintendent came in to do a check, and of course, when he came in, he found all this Al-Qaeda literature everywhere, computers, walkie-talkies. He thought there was an Al-Qaeda cell. So they ended up calling the Joint Terrorism Task Force, responded from Newark, and they raided the house. They raided the apartment. They were using it to spy on the MSA at Rutgers and mount other operations in New Jersey without telling anybody. So in that particular case, we knew that they had been in there, and we wanted to get the 911 call. So Matt.
So we FOIA'd for all the records in the 911 call, and they wouldn't give them to us. And then we FOIA'd for all the records related to our request, and we found that as soon as we filed this request, the New Brunswick Police Department immediately went to another police department in a different state and said, somebody's trying to get records related to that thing in New Brunswick. What should you do? And this other police department in this other state said, don't give it to him, absolutely don't give it to him. So once we had that, our brilliant lawyer, who's here in the audience, Karen Kaiser, said, we sued, and like within an hour.
Nobody wants any of these Freedom of Information Act cases to go to court because it establishes precedent.
You mentioned the documents. We didn't get the documents until after the very first story we wrote in August 2011, where the NYPD denied all of this, and people who had participated didn't understand why would the NYPD deny what they had been doing for years, right? Because if it was right, why would they deny it? And which surprised us too, because we thought if they just said, yeah, this is great, we're keeping the city safe, then we might not have written another story. Okay.
One other question, I know there's a number of people, I see a lone hand in the back there, going back from one side to another. And then, the book stand is open in the back.
We'll sign some books.
Yeah, we will sign books. And it's a thriller. It's not a policy book. It's been lost in all these discussions. This is a thriller.
So he says.
I wanted to know if you have seen any signs that the NYPD will now use this surveillance they have against the general population.
Oh, yeah.
To say that they aren't profiling just because they want to go after somebody.
This was the thing that was my favorite thing of the book. So everybody remember the Times Square bombing where the guy in the bike drives up in the middle of the night and he puts a little pipe bomb in front of the recruiting center and it blows the door off the recruiting center and busts out a window. Nobody's harmed, but they're still looking for the guy who did it. So a few months after the bombing, the NYPD opens up a preliminary investigation into this guy Burke and
Dennis Burke.
So Burke is sort of this anarchist character, and the predicate for opening the investigation is that we have an informant who tells us that at one point 3 years ago Burke ran a website called bombsandshields.com. And bombsandshields.com is basically a clearinghouse for protest news. So pictures and news about protests from all across, anti-globalization protests, whatever. And so the bombing happened at 3 in the morning. And the police department said, well, at 6 a.m., Bombs and Shields linked to a Fox News story about this bombing in Times Square. It only took him 3 hours to post that link. That suggests that he may have known about it in advance. So with that link to the Fox News article and the fact that Dennis Burke participates in critical mass bike rides, thus has access to a bike, they open up a preliminary investigation. The preliminary investigation continues. They end up flying an undercover officer. They put an undercover officer in critical mass groups. They put him in Time's Up New York. And they fly an undercover officer to New Orleans for what's known for the People's Summit, which is sort of an anti-globalization group. And this is all for the bombing, and all for Dennis Burke, who was not there. They end up putting people in files who are labor organizers for nannies, people who are Palestinian justice, guys who write newsletters about anti-globalization. All of this stuff ends up in police files, and it just sort of spins off. And this is sort of that snowballing way. It spins off of it. What started with a link to a Fox News article as predicate ends up, all these people who were at the anti-globalization meeting in New Orleans end up in police files.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much for attending.